Hello and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar on lithium-ion batteries. I'm Natalie Starkey, Chemistry World Science Media Producer, and I'm here with you for the next hour where we'll be hearing from two scientists working on different aspects of battery recycling research. Now, lithium-ion batteries are at the heart of many of the tech devices we use daily, including smartphones, laptops, electric vehicles, and much more. With all of these devices and their batteries having a limited lifetime and the growth of electric vehicles rising exponentially, it's clear how we could quickly become inundated with batteries to be disposed of. So how best do we go about deconstructing and recycling batteries and their components? Is it even sensible to do so? And how are we doing at the moment? To answer these questions and more, we've invited two guests here with us today to speak about this very subject, and I will introduce them shortly. Now, this webinar follows on from a special issue of Chemistry World focusing on the future of energy storage, lithium and beyond, which has a number of related features you might be interested in checking out after the webinar. We'll post the link to that in the chat now. Before we get started though, we'd like to thank our sponsors today. We have Agilent Technologies. Agilent is a global leader of life sciences, diagnostics and applied markets, recognised for uncompromising integrity. Their mission is to advance quality of life by focusing in 6 key markets. You can read a little bit more about them here or find some more information on our website. We also have Shimadzu, who are a global leader in the manufacturing of precision analytical instrumentation. Their strategy of innovation through extensive investment in research and development is core to their approach to the manufacture of innovative solutions. And we also have TA Instruments, a division of Waters Corporation, who provide leading battery researchers and manufacturers with the advanced analytical characterization tools needed to develop higher performing and safer battery technology. So thank you again to our sponsors for helping to make this webinar possible. Now, our guests today are Linda Gaines and Emma Kendrick. Linda Gaines is a transportation systems analyst in the Energy Systems and Infrastructure Analysis Division at Argonne National Laboratory in the US. Linda's primary interest is problem solving applied to efficient use of resources. Her most recent work has involved studying ways to reduce impacts from transport by recycling of lithium-ion batteries, hence why we've invited her here today to speak. We also have Emma Kendrick, who's Professor of Energy Materials in the School of Metallurgy and Materials at the University of Birmingham in the UK and co-director of the Centre for Energy Storage and also group lead of the Energy Materials Group. Before academia, Emma led innovations in the battery industry and has since been recognised for her research in sustainable batteries and her continued support to the research community through several awards. We're very lucky to have these two people with us today. Now, this session is interactive, allowing you to ask questions about any aspect of what's covered. Now, you're able to do this on the GoToWebinar platform at any time during the hour, even now, or during the presentations, and I'll be able to put your questions to our presenters in the live Q&A in the second half of the webinar. As a quick explainer, on GoToWebinar, there's usually a panel down one side of your screen, although this might be different depending on which platform you're using, especially if you've joined us via a tablet or phone. Now, somewhere on that panel, there's a questions box, and you can pop your questions in there at any time. So before I hand over to Linda and Emma, I just want to do a quick poll to find out a little bit about the audience here today. We have quite a lot of you in the room. It would be great to hear about your experience of the subject being covered in today's webinar. So Chris, if you could bring up the poll for me, that would be great. Thank you. So yeah, what's your experience with the subject being covered today? Do you work on lithium-ion battery recycling? I expect we've got some people in the room who do. Do you work in a related or a different field? Do you not know much about the topic, or do you know nothing at all? Which is absolutely fine. We welcome everybody today, and we know that you're all going to be learning something and taking something home. So I'm going to give you maybe a minute to put in your experience into the poll. Got quite a few people already answering that question. It's always interesting to know who we've got here. Going to give that a few more minutes, well, not for a few more seconds. Okay, we're getting towards nearly, a lot of people have voted. Okay, I think we can close the poll there if that's all right. And actually, if we could show the results, I think that would be really interesting to see who we've got. Okay, so not so many battery recycling experts, but luckily we do have two with us today, so that's handy. And a bit of a mix between all the other groups there. So that's really good to know. And I think for our speakers, it's really useful for you to know when you're presenting now who we're speaking to. So thank you so much for engaging with that poll. It's really handy for us to know who we've got. So I'm going to welcome Linda Gaines onto screen now. So Linda, if you'd like to turn on your webcam and your audio. There we go. Okay. I can see you and hear you. I've got, okay. Let's see how we get on. I'll let you know if there's any problems.
So good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. First, I want to just say a little bit about argon. Argon is one of the United States Department of Energy's 17 national laboratories. It's a general purpose lab started actually at the end of World War II to develop nuclear power for peaceful uses. Right now, it is particularly expert in battery technology, everything from developing the battery materials to manufacturing techniques to the work we're doing, which then lets us close the circle. The picture on the right there is a battery from a Chevrolet Bolt, which has now been discontinued, but it gives you an idea of sort of the structure of the battery. It's a big enclosure with lots of modules, and in each module there are individual cells. Now, why are we doing electric vehicles? Well, the whole idea is that EVs reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also reduce our dependence on petroleum. And we've done life cycle analysis looking at the energy use and also the emissions of various different pollutants across the life cycle of the whole vehicle, actually, starting from materials in the ground or in the sea or wherever they are, and going through towards the time when the material is no longer usable and is either disposed of or recycled. And what you can see from this graph is that the two bars on the right are the electric vehicles, and they have much lower impacts than the conventional vehicle, and that's actually only going to get better as the grid gets cleaner. So at least we're doing sort of the right thing for greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that we've shown with our life cycle analysis and looked across a whole set of different parameters is that recycling actually reduces the impacts below those you saw on the previous slide. And of the recycling technologies, direct recycling, where the cathode material can actually be recovered in its crystalline form without breaking it down back to its original elements, enables much better performance, much more savings on energy use and water, and also is much cheaper. So that's what we are concentrating our research on. Now, I'm shifting, that was kind of background. The focus on this is more on the materials involved in the batteries. And current technology uses NMC, or in the case of Tesla, NCA cathodes that use nickel, cobalt, and also manganese. And so we can look at the supplies of these materials. And this presentation is really done from a US standpoint, but there are similar considerations in the UK and Europe as well. And what we find is that the United States does not have sufficient reserves of nickel or cobalt to supply even 1 year's demand for these materials if all of our vehicles produced were in fact electric vehicles. So we're going to be reliant on nickel and cobalt imports from cobalt comes from Congo, the nickel comes from Indonesia and Russia, and it's not a very comfortable position to be entirely dependent on imports. our reserves of lithium are indeed sufficient for a good start on an industry. In the long term, we might need to do something more than rely on domestic lithium. But at this point, there's very little actually being produced in the US as sort of a, what can we do? Now, it's one step worse than that, because not only do we not have the materials domestically, we don't have the capacity to actually process them. So what happens when the Chile is extracted from brines in Chile, the lithium is then sent to China to get refined, and only then, in fact, it's one step worse than that, because it's then made into cathode in China or Japan, and only then is it sent to the United States. And this is something that the Biden administration has noticed, and they have put in several pieces of legislation to provide incentives for domestic supply and processing of the materials. And there's been a significant investment made to build up capacity for the processing of these materials. But it's really sort of one step worse, because the same thing happens with recycled materials. The current recycling technologies that are in place in the United States are mostly just shredding the battery, in which case the material is sent back to the Far East to be processed after it's shredded, or the material is made into precursors to cathode, intermediate chemicals, and those also would get sent back to the Far East. So these materials are going around the world a couple of times. So that's another advantage for direct recycling, where in fact the cathode material is the product, and it does not then need to be sent anywhere to be made into cells and batteries, for which the US does have reasonable capacity to actually produce its own. I should not denigrate all US recyclers. There are a couple of US recyclers that have figured that out, and in particular, Ascend Elements and Redwood are making cathode themselves. Now, so clearly one needs to be recycling these materials and recycling them domestically to maximize the amount of sort of self-reliance in battery production. So the next question that we ask is, well, how much good can recycling do when? And the answer, unfortunately, is it's going to take a while. And the graph on the right kind of shows you why. And that is the two factors that are key here. One is that the growth of the use of these batteries is extremely rapid. And so what that means is that the quantity that is being used today is way more than the quantity that was used one battery lifetime ago. And the battery lifetime is long, so one battery lifetime ago is a long time. In this particular graph, we're just guessing 10 years, really, and it's proven to be longer. But what that shows is that if you could get everything back from 10 years ago, you would only be able to supply about 7% or 8% of your material demand with recycled material. So that's kind of bad news until, and as I'll show later, until demand growth stops. And it's a little more complicated to do this analysis because, as you can see on the lower left, different products have different lifespans. So, for instance, an electric vehicle is likely to last a lot longer than a mobile phone battery. So we actually did this analysis in a little bit more detail and looked at demand for these materials In the upper left, it's the battery mass overall, and then in the other graphs, it's the lithium, the cobalt, and the nickel. And so what you can see is that between now and 2030, in general, we're going to be having a growing percentage of our supply available from recycling. No, this is an upper bound. This is assuming everything comes back as soon as possible. It's assuming no exports, no losses, nothing even going into reuse. So if you could get everything back as soon as possible, you would still only be getting about 10%. And the difference in the elements is because of the difference in the product mix. The cathode mixes are changing such that batteries have more and more nickel in them and less cobalt. And so what you can see in the lower left is that the percentage of cobalt demand that you could supply is actually not nearly as low, because the demand for cobalt is going down. This is kind of a key graph that points out the importance of different factors in supplying something. And that blue curve is an arbitrary made-up demand curve for something which we'll call product. And what you can see in the graphs below is if you could get all of that product back after 10 years, you would be getting the amount of material in the sort of gray dotted line. And what you can see on that is that it's only after the supply curve, the demand curve flattens out, that you can start getting a significant fraction of your material from recovered material. The orange curve is the other interesting one, and that's scrap. We've arbitrarily assumed in this that 20% scrap is made during the production process. And that scrap does not add to the supply of material. In fact, it's material that needs to be processed multiple times. But what you can see on the green curve is the sum of the scrap plus the recycled material. And what that is the quantity of material that is available for recycling. And the scrap greatly exceeds the recyclable material from end of use until something like 15 years out from the beginning of production, which means that recycling plants are relying on scrap for their feedstock now. And that's a key point that is often overlooked. And it in fact is the enabler for a profitable recycling industry in the early years of battery production. So what we've just shown is that recycled material is not going to be a huge contributor, at least out till 2030. If you could get all of it back, how much are we really getting back? There have been people talking for a long time about how only 5% of lithium-ion batteries get recycled. That was a number that somebody estimated somewhere around 2010, and it became gospel and had a life of its own, such that even high officials in the US Department of Energy have been citing that number recently, in spite of the fact that it's total nonsense. So what Circular Energy Storage, who's one of our collaborators on this work, has shown from the best data that can be obtained is that, in fact, for the US, something like half of the batteries actually are getting recycled. About 10% of them are getting recycled, that is shredded, in the US, and then the material is exported. And the rest, about 40%, is actually being recycled in China. Globally, the number that is something like 60% of batteries actually getting recycled. But there's a big red caveat on these results because it's extremely difficult to get the data, and there's a lot of uncertainty in it, but the point is that there's actually a lot of material already getting recycled. So that looks a little bit pessimistic for actually supplying our own materials and having recycling help in the process. So what other options are there? Well, we can think about using other materials. And, people have been talking about, at least in the US, about how can we catch up with China? And to me, that's marginally absurd in that they've got control of the materials, they've got the infrastructure set up, labor is cheaper, construction costs are cheaper. Catching up is perhaps futile. So can we think about actually doing something different and maybe jumping ahead? So other potential battery technologies or chemistries that we can think about LFP, we can think about higher manganese content cathode materials. There have been experiments and preliminary production with sodium-ion batteries to reduce the dependence on lithium. Sulfur is another possible anode material, so people are looking at lithium sulfur batteries. Solid state batteries use lithium metal as the anode, and there are new announcements about new chemistry plants being built, large scale, all over the world, coming out just about every day. And in fact, solid state batteries are one major possibility that is a technology with higher energy density. So we want to look at the materials for all of those technologies as well. So looking at the US supplies.
Linda, sorry to interrupt you.
5 minutes.
About 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Sure. So phosphorus and iron are pretty abundant. There are questions about what the grade of the phosphorus ore and how easy it is to purify. But this is known technology, and there are plants being planned in North America to produce lithium iron phosphate. And in fact, both of those materials are pretty abundant, so we're not likely to run out. And I've included this graph to give you an idea of the quantity of iron ore that's mined compared to everything else globally. This is a free open access graph. It's, to me, quite startling. Manganese is also abundant globally. US reserves are lower quality than what we currently import, so we're not using US reserves. It's another material that would keep us from being quite as dependent on what the US government euphemistically calls countries of concern. So if we're thinking about sodium-ion batteries, sodium is certainly not an issue with essentially unlimited supplies available from seawater. Sulfur is a waste product, so that would not be something that we would be worried about supplies of. The only thing I would think about if we were thinking about lithium sulfur batteries was whether it would be worthwhile to recycle them because the raw materials are maybe too low value. Silicon, is another potential anode material, and it's again very abundant. Lithium for anodes. Lithium metal would be needed. The United States is already a major producer on the world scale in lithium metal, although the actual production would need to be increased by something like a factor of 400 for large scale battery manufacture. The thing that's kind of missing for lithium metal is a good technology for producing it. The current technology relies on electrolysis of lithium chloride, and that's a nasty process, and you get lots and lots of chlorine. So it's still an interesting area because it's a place we're not already way behind the curve. And the last thing I'm going to say about different materials is that there's research going on. This graph is from J. Caesar, the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research that's headquartered at Oregon. The current batteries really aren't good enough for aircraft or even for long haul trucking. So there's lots of research on new technologies. And the last important thing I want to talk about is we're assuming in all of this that everybody's going to have a vehicle that has an 80 or 100 kilowatt hour battery with a 400-mile range. In fact, people can supply their transportation needs with much smaller quantities of material used. Plug-in hybrid batteries are a factor of something like 6 smaller than pure electrics. A range extended EV would enable a long range with a small battery, and the supplementary fuel doesn't even need to be a fossil fuel. It could be a biofuel. There are more advanced options like in-road charging that are being considered. If you electrify the roadways, then you don't need much range on your battery. You just need it for local travel because the major highway could enable charging as you drove. It's possible that battery swapping, which is very popular for personal mobility, electric bicycles, things like that, is possible for cars as well, and that would enable smaller batteries. And there are all kinds of different things you can imagine, like rental modules for long trips. And that's without even discussing things like car and ride sharing or mass transit that enable you to get where you're going, but without your own personal vehicle. So in conclusion, EVs do reduce transport impacts. Recycling will be important in the long term. Batteries are being recycled now. Scrap is good, but doesn't add to your supply. It just enables you to get your recycling industry started. But we're still going to need lots more material to satisfy all of the growth. And there are all kinds of alternative materials that are being thought of, and we can also use the material more efficiently. I want to thank my co-authors and our sponsors from Aramco America. Actually, most of this work was not sponsored by the Department of Energy, which basically said, oh, you're not going to be able to get the data, so we won't fund you. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to our organizers and hear what Emma has to say.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Linda. Wow, we've covered loads. That was really detailed and super interesting, and so much food for thought there. I love the fact that, do we need a 400-mile range on our cars? Most people think, oh, I'm not going to buy an electric car because I might need to drive 400 miles. How often do you actually do that? Not very often in my case. So lots to think about. I'm going to hand straight over to Emma though. Because I want to leave questions for time for questions at the end. Lots of questions coming in from the audience. Please keep sending them in when you're listening to Emma. We've got her presentation on screen now, so I'm going to go quiet and let you take it away.
Thank you very much, and what a great introduction and presentation from Linda. I think what came across to me very strongly is that we really do need to consider where our materials come from, and then what happens to our materials when they come to their end of life too. And it really does give a great introduction to some of the aspects of material sourcing that I'm going to talk about next. So what I'd like to cover today is really following on from what Linda has said, talking about the materials themselves, and I'll introduce you to a concept which is called critical materials. I'll also then talk about one of the examples of next generation technologies that Linda introduced as well in sodium-ion battery examples, and then talk a little bit about how we need to think about recycling and, again, recovering those materials for potentially reusing them again. And if we directly reuse them from recovery, this is called direct recycling. In terms of sustainability, though, we need to start thinking of things in a more holistic term or viewpoint, because it's not just about the materials that we use in the batteries, but how we manufacture, how long that battery actually lasts in its first life, for example, before we then look at recycling and recovering those materials for potentially putting back into that circular material cycle flow. So what is a critical material? Now, this in front of you is the critical material list for Europe. This is where materials have been categorized as high economic importance and supply risk. And those that are both are a critical material. And the ones that I've cycled in red are the materials that we use in lithium-ion batteries. And I'm just going to go through these. We have natural graphite. This is used in the anode. We have phosphorus and phosphate rock. Now, phosphate rock is of strong economic importance because it's used in fertilizers, although there is a very low supply risk in Europe. We have cobalt, we have silicon metal, and we have lithium. So a huge number of elements and materials that we use in batteries are actually on this critical material list. The ones that I've circled in blue are some of the other materials that we use. Most of them are of strong economic importance, but are very abundant, and there's less of a supply risk associated with them. One thing to note is that different regions have their own critical materials list for that economic importance and supply chain. In Europe, this was the last assessment was done in 2020. And there's just a couple of things to highlight here. Most of the cobalt, 68% of it, comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in Europe, in 2020, when this assessment was done, almost 80% of the lithium came from Chile. I'm going to, on the next slide, show you where some of the other supplies of these materials are. Now, as I said, critical materials are assessed in different regions of the world, and we have now a UK critical materials list, which you can see on the right-hand side, and there is also an equivalent one for the US as well, and you can see that on the right. But essentially, all of the metals and materials that I've already listed are generally classed as critical for most regions: cobalt, lithium, graphite. Nickel less so, and you can see nickel is elevated criticality for the UK and not so critical for the US. But as we start to put more and more nickel into our batteries, then maybe we need to consider again where this comes from. So cobalt, as I said, is mostly sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This was this year's production, I believe, 120,000 metric tons. Smaller producers are Russia and Australia. Some of the things that need to be considered about the cobalt is ethical supply. In some areas, for example, there's many artisanal mines where local families mine the cobalt and then sell it on, and this is actually the main producer or the main earner, breadwinner for their families. Quite often children can be employed in these artisanal mines, but again, they are the main breadwinners or the money earners for some of those families. So consideration around supporting those communities for schooling, education, hospitals does need to be considered when we start to think about this. It's called ESG. Lithium comes from two different sources. It comes from a rock called spodumene, which I think is a great name for a rock, and also salars. Salars are large areas of water, and in deep pockets, there's high concentration of lithium. This then gets pumped out and the water is evaporated off, and you end up with lithium chloride, which can then be processed back into lithium carbonate, hydroxide, or as we heard earlier, lithium metal. Now, currently, over 50% of the production of lithium actually comes from Australia, from the spodumene rock, and about 25% from Chile from those salars that I spoke about. But as you saw in Europe, in 2020, we were still sourcing most of our lithium from South America. And again, considerations around biodiversity areas are really key here. A lot of the places in South America are in areas where there are protected species. One of those, for example, is flamingos in some of those areas. And if we turn and think about graphite, graphite is actually mostly produced in China. And I think these numbers are very stark. We have 820,000 metric tons being produced by China. And then 68,000 is the next largest producer in Brazil. That's a huge amount of reliance on one country for the production and the supply of all of our anode materials, or most of our anode materials, graphite, for lithium-ion batteries. So what is this sustainability? Now, I've talked about the criticality of materials, and what can we do here? Well, we can reduce the quantity of critical materials that we use. So, for example, cobalt is being replaced with nickel, which is less critical. Or we can substitute. So we can substitute the lithium, for example, for sodium. And we can start to looking at creating a circular economy for these minerals and metals as well, so that they're not shipped back to China to reprocess so that we buy it back again, but we start to reprocess, recover, and then remanufacture within the same geographical areas. The other things that we need to consider, though, is that energy usage. How much energy is used to do that processing and those manufacturing, and what kind of environmental impact does that have? Now, we spoke earlier, and Linda introduced sodium-ion batteries. This, in a way, is one of the most obvious ways to reduce that reliance on critical materials for lithium, substituting for sodium. Sodium can be sourced from seawater, so it's less geographically limited. And because it's so abundant, the cost is substantially lower than lithium. So here you can see the cost for lithium hydroxide is $75,000 per ton. As for sodium hydroxide, it's only $900 per ton. This seems like a really good option. We can also then start to substitute maybe nickel and cobalt for more manganese type materials, and also substitute the graphite, the anode, for materials such as hard carbon, which are used in sodium-ion batteries, which can be made from renewable sources. So this is really interesting, sodium instead of lithium. And one of the things I wanted to show here is the value, or the cost of the metals that are contained within some of these materials. On the left-hand side, I've got a range of lithium-ion cathodes. Spodumene is a primary ore. And then we've got some cathode materials, NCA, which is nickel, cobalt, alumina, the NMCs with different ratios of nickel, manganese, and cobalt. We've got lithium iron phosphate, lithium manganese spinel. And you can see, I found this very interesting, that's actually more value in our cathode materials in terms of lithium, which is the blue bar at the bottom, than in some of our primary ores, such as spodumene. And interestingly, in the current recycling methods, which I'll take you through, lithium is not necessarily reclaimed. The other valuable metals contained within the lithium ion is the cobalt and the nickel. And if we move to the lithium ion sources and the lithium manganese, then you can see there's very little value from those metals. But it is definitely worthwhile recycling just for that lithium content, if not for the others. If we move then into sodium ion, and I've put down here 3 of the main cathodes that are being developed globally: nickel, manganese, iron, a sodium vanadium phosphate, and a Prussian blue analog, in this case containing manganese and iron. And you can see that the value of these is actually relatively low. We only have value in the nickel for the layered oxide, only value in the vanadium for the vanadium phosphate. And then we move to the Prussian blue analog, there's very little value in the material at all. Now, this is quite interesting because most of the value that is put on what is recycled is in the black mass that's recovered at the end of the process, which is mainly the cathode material. So if your cathode material has no value, my question would be, can we actually recycle? Is it economically viable to do so or not? And if we're talking about sustainability, then maybe some of our efforts should be looking at maximizing that first life or in use of that battery, and potentially enabling second life applications as well. So if we talk about recycling in particular, there's different methods. The method that we spoke about earlier is shredding. This is actually a Gen 1 Nissan Leaf cell, which is going through a shredder. We have put so much effort, time, energy, engineering into these cells. We make them beautifully engineered so that they last as long as possible. And then we put them through a shredder, which means that all of that careful engineering and the separation of those materials, the graphite, electrode, anode, to the cathode, just gets all crumpled together and everything gets mixed. One of my colleagues once said this is a bit like making a Victoria sponge, which is a sponge cake with jam and cream in the middle, putting the entire thing into a blender and then expecting to be able to extract out the jam, the cream, the eggs and the flour after it's been through the blender. So are there better ways of doing this? Well, this is some work that's been done at the University of Birmingham by one of my colleagues, Rob Somerville. He's been looking at trying to disassemble the cells instead. So can we keep the materials in purer materials waste streams so that we can process them more easily, get less contamination, and then start to recover those materials for direct recycling? Here we've just got little sensors in the suction cups which are looking at conductivity, and we can start to separate out the separator, which is the plastics, and then the anode coating from the cathode coating. Now this is very early stages of research, and it's something that we're looking to further develop, whilst also looking to see if we can purify those materials waste streams from the recycling route as well. So this just gives you an example of the process that we need to follow if we're going to disassemble our cell, and the different waste streams that are created from that disassembly route. So we open the cell, we stabilize it, we start to separate out those components, the anodes and cathodes. We can then delaminate the anodes and cathodes coatings off of the current collectors and then reclaim aluminium foil and copper foil. We're then left with a black mass. In this case, we have a graphite black mass, which is mostly graphite, and we have a cathodic black mass, which is mostly the layered oxides, which contain lithium and the transition metals. We can then process the graphite to reuse back in the battery again, and we can look at processing the cathode as well to directly reuse back in the battery again. Or we can use hydrometallurgical routes to recover the transition metal salts for remaking the cathode material. So first of all, we looked at direct recycling of these materials. This is how the materials are reclaimed. They're reclaimed in kind of flakes off of the current collector. There's still some binder in there. Now that binder needs to be removed somehow before it's useful. Quite often it's just burnt its polymeric binder PVDF. Fortunately, this produces HF, which is not very nice, so other ways of getting rid of the binder are preferred. If we could wash it out with water, that would be even better. And so a lot of work is going into water-based binder systems that we can actually use to design the cell for recovery and recycling, as well as lowering the cost of manufacturing. The graphite itself, as you can see, we can reuse directly. And this gives you an example of the electrochemistry that you'd see from a rejected cell, QC reject, or end of life. And both of them give us pretty decent capacities. And then on the left-hand side is the electrochemistry that you would see from a cathode. This probably is about half the capacity that you'd want from a cathode. And this is because during the processing, a lot of the lithium is lost, and we need to put the lithium back into that cathode again before we can actually reuse it in this direct recycling process. However, if we have this concentrated transition metals, we can actually leach out these transition metals, remove the contaminants, copper, aluminium, and then change the concentration of those transition metals to upscale it to the current technologies. Because the old technologies, such as the Nissan Leaf, which was originally a mixed cathode of the spinel and an NCA, isn't used really very much anymore. And more typically, high nickel-based materials are used instead. NMC 622, NMC 811. So we can change the concentration of these transition metals. We can then reprecipitate the hydroxides, lithiate, and remanufacture or upscale the cathode material. And what we did here was show that the level of impurities that we got in those materials waste streams made a huge difference in terms of our specific capacities of our reclaimed and remanufactured cathodes. So it didn't matter whether you reclaimed your materials from a disassembly route or a shredded route. What mattered was the impurity concentration. And if you could remove those impurities, then you could get your cathodes to perform very similarly to what you would expect a pristine cathode that you would purchase to manufacture as well. And here we just show you, because we can, a full recycled cell in which we've remanufactured the NMC 622, and it's a recovered graphite. This is a little pouch cell that we made, which cycles actually pretty well for recycled materials, and very similar to what we would expect pristine materials to cycle as well. So then we come on to sodium ion. So we've already said that sodium-ion materials are really low cost. So we're not sure that the economics stack up for recycling. However, the value is not just in the metal content, but also in the way, in the morphology and the design of the material itself. And although most of the valorization of the materials is currently on those transition metals, potentially we need to think of another way of valuing those materials that we can reclaim, particularly if they retain the morphology of the materials for direct recycling. What we can also do is start to design in ways for recyclability, so design for disassembly, such that we can use water-based binder systems, remove some of the glues from the battery pack so that we can reclaim these materials much more easily and with less energy inputs. So making it a more viable process. And certainly for sodium ion, I think this is what we need to do. So to just summarize, sustainability is more than just the material cost. The material value for recycling is important, as is the energy and the environmental input. What we need to do is reduce or substitute some of those raw materials, for example, sodium for lithium, nickel for cobalt, manganese for nickel. But also we need to look at the full life cycle of these materials, so maximize the lifetime of the cell itself, particularly for first life, but potentially we can maximize for a second life application as well. We also need to look at recycling and recovering those materials, and possibly designing in from the beginning ways that we can do this in a design for disassembly, and then looking at how we reuse those materials in direct loop or short loop recycling processes. Thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Emma. Goodness me, we've covered loads in this webinar already, and we're having in so many questions. So I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can with you guys in the last 10 minutes or so. But yeah, keep sending your questions in, because I can combine questions sometimes that we can get through a few more, and then we'll try and do our best. So yeah, one of the questions to both of you, but I think it popped up more actually in Emma's talk. It just kind of stuck with me then. One of the questions relates to how are we going to reuse lithium batteries? You mentioned that was, you know, one way to kind of maximize their lifetime. How can we reuse them? If we finish with our electric vehicle batteries, or anything else we can do with it, or mobile phones? I've just had my mobile phone battery changed because it died after 2 years, which is disappointing because it's expensive. What else can be done with them?
So maybe if I go first and then pass over to Linda for comments as well. So particularly for automotive applications, the battery packs are really highly engineered, and the cells are cycled to a certain percentage of their initial capacity. So typically 80 or 70% is put on them, which means that by the time they end, they still have 70% of their energy available within the cell. The other thing is that the automotive application is very demanding. So it needs a lot out of the battery pack. It needs fast charge, fast discharge, and you get these very complicated drive cycles that the battery undergoes. If you treat it a bit gently, slow charge, slow discharge, you can actually get the battery to last an awful lot longer than it would do in an automotive application. So some people are looking at repurposing some of the batteries from electric vehicles, for example, in kind of stationary devices where you charge from solar or renewable during the day, and then you can just charge slowly over the evening, so that you start to treat your batteries more gently, and then you can eke out a potential second life application from them. There are obviously a lot of issues with this because they still need to have a warranty. So how do you warranty something that's come to its end of life, first life? That's a question that hasn't been solved, I don't think, yet. And also predictability is difficult if it's got to the end of that first life as well. Safety, possibly another one. So there are some issues that need to be overcome, but that's where research comes in.
Exactly. I'm going to move on because I really want to get through some of these questions. And I know, Linda, you might have something, so I'm going to ask you a different question so we can see what we can get through. Someone, and I've lost who asked this question, I'm very sorry, I've lost your name, but they wanted to know what's the most challenging obstacle we need to overcome to switch to a more efficient method of battery recycling. Big question. I don't know if you have an answer for that one.
I think that the disassembly problem that the ReLive people are working on is really key. And design for recycling is not something that I've seen US battery manufacturers embrace seriously. So dealing with the current designs is really a challenge.
So it's about thinking more from the start of,
yeah,
of
I mean,
the process.
I really like the Victoria sponge example.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I've seen that in the Chemistry World feature, and I absolutely loved it. It's one of our pull-out quotes. I think it just really sticks in my head then. I'm like, yes, that would be hard to do. Okay, someone's asked, is there any loss of efficacy of metal on recycling? And that's to either of you, I think.
I missed what the question was.
Is there any loss of efficacy of the metal on recycling? I'm guessing not. I'm guessing you don't recover all of it efficiently, but I'm guessing it's still the metal. It still works as it should do if you recover it cleanly.
There is a question on direct recycling as to how good the cathode can be when you recover it, but that's why you relithiate, and it's why you do careful tests to make sure that the cathode is up to snuff, because nobody's going to buy something that doesn't perform as well as good as new.
Okay, we spoke a bit about sodium hydroxide versus lithium hydroxide. This sounds great to me. I'm like, okay, it's cheaper. Yes, this all sounds good. Are there any difficulties that need to be overcome if we start switching over to sodium hydroxide as our materials?
So sodium-ion batteries are obviously different to lithium-ion in that sodium is heavier, which means, and it actually operates at a slightly lower voltage range as well, which means the energy density of a sodium-ion battery is always going to be lower than that of the high-energy lithium-ion batteries. But saying that, there are many, many different applications for batteries. And if we're reliant on only one chemistry, that's going to be a problem. Sodium-ion batteries, low cost, they're starting to be produced by some firms in China. So CATL, for example, have said that they're going to be producing cells this year for sale. And the first thing that people are going to look at is potentially stationary energy storage for low cost, where weight isn't a problem necessarily, but also things like 2-3 wheelers, so small vehicles, which you could possibly put these into as well.
Oh, that's exciting. I never heard that. That would be quite fun. I remember 3-wheeler cars when I was younger. Let me see. We've got a question, really interesting question actually, from Hamilton. Is the charge of spent batteries a problem for the shredder step? You've shown that amazing video of just that lovely, beautiful battery being shredded. Yeah, is that a problem? What happens with that?
So there's different things that you can do. If you've got a lot of energy left in your battery pack, you can reclaim it and put it back into the grid again, for example. So you can actually discharge it and reuse some of that energy. If you put all of that into the shredder, you would have issues in that you would end up with fires and thermal runaways. And the interesting thing about batteries is it has a fuel and an oxidant, which means you don't have to have air for it to set on fire. So if you mixed your fuel and your oxidant and it heated up, then you would end up with a fire. And some people use that in the shredder because it helps to debind things as well. So if you, it's not a very nice way of doing it, but it does get done. Preferably, if you're looking at health and safety aspects, so you would prefer to discharge your cell first, reclaim the energy from the cell, and then put it through the shredder so you don't get any events happening as you put it through the teeth.
Okay, thank you so much. What a great question, it turns out. Right, I'm going to have one final question. I'm going to probably aim this at Linda, if that's okay. It's a really interesting question, which I'm going to paraphrase from Singh. We had it on email into us today. It's about basically how many countries have adopted battery recycling. And my question to add on to that is, do we know if the biggest producers of lithium-ion batteries are also the biggest recyclers, or is there a big problem there that I don't know if we know the answer to this question, but I know China produces a lot of lithium-ion batteries and they also do really well with recycling of them. Do we know much about that? Are there some countries that are producing loads and not doing any recycling?
At this point, I think battery recycling is starting to be profitable. And so you keep seeing reports of somebody building a recycling plant in Poland or Hungary. I would assume that most of these plants are using manufacturing scrap as their primary feed. So the recycling plants are kind of following in the wake of the large growth of manufacturing capacity that's being put in lots and lots of countries. So I unfortunately, I think it's rather sort of primitive technology recycling. Most of the plants that you hear about are just shredders, and some of them do have hydrometallurgical capacity, but There is recycling capacity for direct recycling that's being at least built with US government support in the US. So hopefully there will be more advanced recycling that comes online. I should also mention that manufacturing scrap may not require as many processing steps as recycling of end-of-life material. Something like cathode scrap is just cathode powder on aluminum foil to a first approximation. And so you don't need to go through a whole hydrometallurgical process to get that material back.
Okay, so some of it is relatively straightforward. That sounds promising. I'm really sad that we've run out of time for any more questions, and I'm really sorry if we didn't get around to answering all the questions and your question wasn't answered today. But thank you so much to our audience for joining in today. It looks like a really popular topic. People are really engaged with this. And I think that was down to the fact that we had such brilliant guests. Thank you, Linda and Emma. They were just brilliant presentations. We've all learned a lot to go and think about. So yeah, thank you so much. I'd also like to say a big thank you to our sponsors today again. That was Agilent Technologies, Shimadzu and TA Instruments, who are a division of Waters Corporation. Now, if you've enjoyed this webinar, then please do check out chemistryworld.com/webinars for future events. And while you're there, then feel free to register for a Chemistry World account, where you can sign up to our very popular reaction newsletter that includes a weekly digest of big stories from across the world of chemistry. And that's it from me. I'm Natalie Starkey, Chemistry World Science Media Producer, and I look forward to seeing you again in a future Chemistry World webinar.